The first thing I did was to go out to Lungma Airport, where the China Air Transport headquarters was, and see some of my old pilot buddies. The only way you could find out what was going on was to fly around with these guys and just hopscotch around the country, and with no particular destination in mind other than there's somewhere where it was where there was a war going on.
There was a great deal of admiration among the correspondents for the communists. The general feeling at that point was that we were looking at the Chinese Communist forces essentially as reformers.
It was impossible to convince people that the communists were going to win the war. There wasn't any feeling in this country that there was anything wrong with the Kuomintang government, that they weren't honest Christian Democrats, that they weren't beloved by their people, and would win a well-deserved triumph with no trouble at all.
Anybody that was well-informed in Nanking at the time realized that the communist victory was inevitable. They were going to win.
There in Hong Kong was a kind of curious breed of reporter called the China Watchers. Our job was to report on China from outside of China, in this case, Hong Kong.
The most accurate information that they were getting out of China tended to come from the waves of refugees who came out. And of course that began in the late 40s and went on into the 50s and even into the 60s.
The images were terrible. They were black and white and in terrible condition, but usually that was all the picture we had out of China.
The McCarthy era certainly influenced all media in the sense that no one wanted to be accused by that right-wing fringe or by editors. As a journalist, as a press agency reporter, I had to feel that I had to show appreciation of the evil of China and of communism.
Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China.
They had limited numbers of places for the news media, so as the trip got closer and the interest built in New York, suddenly there are non-technicians, vice presidents, presidents, executive producers, all jumping on the bandwagon and signing on as sound men, electricians.
I knew nothing about China. Nobody had any idea what it really looked like. It really was like going on the moon. What are we going to see? We had no idea what to expect.
We became factionalized because the print people wanted some real contact. The TV people were transmitting pictures that were in themselves sufficient novelty to satisfy their curiosities and their needs.
I think the '72 Nixon trip was pure television, and it had an enormous impact on Americans.
Nixon called it the week that changed the world, and it was a big event.
And this is what's important. It changed our view of China, but it also changed China's view of the United States.
The impact of television on an American audience was extraordinary. China has suddenly come alive, and all the rest is commentary.
I sort of figured China would be open because Nixon had gone, and after the election, China would open, right? But it didn't.
If the story is a 2,500-piece jigsaw, you will only have, at best, probably a few hundred pieces of that jigsaw.
At first, I was filled with trepidation. I mean, I was almost scared the first few months when I was writing these stories, like this is going to blow up in my face, and I'm going to be completely wrong, because we are speculating based on a few people's understanding of what's going on, and we're hypothesizing, and we're not able to go there, we're not able to see it, we're not able to touch it, we're not able to do what reporters normally do.
Good evening. Mao Zedong, the man who for 27 years ruled more than a fifth of the world's population, is dead. The 82-year-old chairman of the Chinese Communist Party died today at 10 minutes after midnight Peking time.
CCTV put up a signal for hours and hours of material on the funeral, and they just put this up, and anyone who wanted it could take it down, and that's where we got the images. And everything else we had to do, telephone calls to Beijing if we could get through to somebody, the wire services, Xinhua, it was scraping whatever we could together.
There was the full normalization of relations between the United States and China, and the Chinese then invited a selection, if you will, of all of the American journalists to come to Beijing.
China was, for the first time since '49, opening itself up a bit.
There was this tremendous hopefulness among a lot of people, academics, students of China, ordinary people who were charmed by the Chinese culture and Chinese civilization, who found something lovable in China that they would never have found in the Soviet Union.
When the Gang of Four had their trial, we weren't allowed to be there. It wasn't televised live, but you saw news clips of it at night. And so then I would write my story after we watched the news clips.
A major battle developed with CCTV over access to the video of the trial. At one point, video came out showing Jiang Jing in her cell, and a bidding war began between ABC and CBS on acquiring this video, which we desperately wanted.
I thought when I left in '83 that China was just beginning to open up to journalists. '83 was when they began to have regular press conferences. The Foreign Ministry had a weekly press conference. That was when they appointed spokesmen for all the ministries and gave out phone numbers. And before that, none of this was available.
The AP itself made it difficult for you to get out because they wanted you to be constantly on top of everything. So there was a certain fear at leaving the Xinhua machine. So, oh my gosh, are we going to actually unstaff the office and all go out and commit news and leave the Xinhua wire unattended? And what if it comes up with the announcement that Deng Xiaoping has died? And he didn't actually die until February of '97. But the whole time I was there was this idea that, if we could have had somebody 24 hours in that office watching the Xinhua machine for news of Deng's death. So that made it hard to get out.
What I remember mostly about the 13th Party Congress, of course, was the famous press conference afterwards.
Remarkably, Zhao Ziyang, the newly elected General Secretary, came out. It was one of those moments, those rare moments when you really see a Chinese leader relaxed. I'm not sure if there's another comparable moment with Westerners, with Western journalists.
I think '88 was the most open year that I ever was able to observe while I was there, which was really exciting because did stories on art and music and things changing, and people talking about sex more than they ever were able to before. People trying out jobs, experiments going on, and some opening up in the media.
The world's largest public square has now become the scene of the biggest demonstration in the history of Communist China.
Hopped on my bicycle and hurtled toward Tiananmen Square, and you could hear the gunfire ahead, and the crowds were rushing the other way, and I kept thinking, this is a crazy job where there's gunfire, everybody in his right mind is running that way, and you're going toward it.
We were immediately noticed, and a squad broke off from this column of troops and headed directly toward us.
You hear that gunfire?
We do hear it.
Okay, we've got to get out of here.
Said, hey, look at that guy in front of the tank. And I looked at it and said, oh my God, zoomed in on it and started videotaping it. And they were trying to scare him off by shooting over his head. Well, shooting over his head was basically at where our position was. It was the 5th floor, the 4th floor, whatever balcony we were on, but the bullets were so close you could hear them whizzing by.
It felt like the invasion of the body snatchers had happened. I mean, it was just like, this was a different country. Nobody would talk to you, everybody was terrified. It was just the most shocking and depressing thing, I've ever seen in my life.
I mean, I'm usually a fairly mellow guy, and be driving along, and these state security goons would be tailing me, and I would go around a corner, and I would catch myself just wishing that those guys would slide out of control and go under a bus.
The Journal covered China a lot more aggressively and a lot more closely than our big newspaper rivals did through most of the 1990s, because we saw it as a central story for our core readership, which is business.
Every time you'd go out to an economic zone or meet a mayor or even a governor or party secretary, who were all pretty accessible in those days, you would sit down and they'd all tell you the same things. And then they'd say, okay, now you're from the Wall Street Journal, we need foreign investment. How do we get more foreign investment? How can you help us? Let us show you what we have everywhere.
By the mid-1990s, it had become easy to travel around, and especially to go to other cities and not stand out, so that you could actually go and do reporting for a few days in a major city without having the police necessarily come and track you down.
The fact that the society itself had started to change, the people were more free to talk and more confident to talk with the journalists, I think made a big difference.
I think that in the early 2000s, we had more freedom and access than we ever had before.
One of the things that I think was interesting to me about Shenzhen was it had been written about as an economic story. Migrants had been written about in terms of they're leaving home, they're going to do these factory jobs. There wasn't a lot of emphasis on their personal lives and their interests. It was a place where people were becoming individuals. I mean, it was a story about individualism in China.
The internet, and especially Weibo, I mean, you know, was like this sort of ginormous nationwide tip line where you could find these extraordinary stories and contacts and pictures and proof videos. So it was extremely important in reporting.
We had you know, our news assistants monitoring the forums even much more so than the Chinese press, because you could, you know, you basically, it was a window into what was happening in society, a very, you know, select sliver of society, but you could really monitor society through that in a way that you couldn't as a correspondent.
You had this slightly schizophrenic story because you could go on one day and write about a dissident who was doing, in many ways, the classic activities of somebody against the full force of the state. And then on Tuesday, you could go and write about the ribbon cutting at the world's largest airport. And trying to put these two side by side in your own head was hard enough, and then trying to put them into the same story was very difficult.
What's going on? The whole building is shaking. The whole building is shaking. Oh my goodness, we're in the middle of an earthquake? Earthquake, the whole block is shaking.
The rescue and relief operation was so intense, and the Chinese really, they had an interest in getting the rest of the world to see what they were up against. And so I think that they had an interest in allowing open reporting. In a way, it was the most exciting time that I was in China as a journalist. It was the only time where I felt that I was working alongside Chinese colleagues and we were working together.
And we got all this wonderful mail about our coverage. I mean, it was almost like this, it saved the foreign journalist coverage. People decided actually the foreigners weren't so bad in covering China because it was a very sympathetic portrait of, you know, how strong the people were in Sichuan.
We used to be able to get on a plane and go to somewhere and spend a week there covering writing about a story, talking to everybody, and coming back and giving the definitive story on this topic. Because of the internet, because of the competitive demands and the 24/7 news cycle, there's been much more emphasis now on just churning out more spot news and less interest in the kind of conventional Washington Post long-form front-page narrative that I think we did so well in the past.
In terms of the daily movement in China, the backstory, the nuance, the analysis of the change that was taking place, that was increasingly difficult to try to sell there, because they're looking for the big bang. They're looking for the spectacular.
The Arab Spring uprisings marked something of a turning point in China and for China's relations with the journalists. I think they came to see the journalist as even more of an enemy than they did before.
You know, the stories that you hear from war zones where you arrive somewhere, you stay 20 minutes and then you move on because people will know that you're there. I mean, you know, increasingly we were having that kind of experience. You get to a village, you'd talk to people for 20 minutes, there'd be a knock on the door, the local officials would come and you would get in trouble.
I knew I was in trouble when they, at the end of 2011, going into 2012, they didn't give me a 1-year visa. They gave me a 2-month visa. And I do not believe that had happened for some time or had ever happened as a strategy. So they were keeping me on a very, very tight leash.
Looking back now, this was the beginning of a very nationalistic, you know, a move towards a much more nationalistic China. And I think those were the themes that we then saw in the Olympic opening ceremony, and the themes that President Xi Jinping's has continued to develop.
We felt we were getting our heads handed to us on a plate every day. And then Mike Forsyth said, well, why don't we do what we're good at, which is numbers, facts, data, and start looking at assets, start looking at building a spreadsheet.
We published the story and everybody was just agog. My God, this is amazing.
The name that came up the most was Wen. And I started with all the rumors and said, just make a list of all the rumors out there and then try to look them up. A lot of people were warning me. They didn't even know what I was doing, exactly who, but they were warning me, if you do anyone related to princelings, you're going to be in big trouble.
My wife got a phone call and the woman said, to Sarah Beth, are you friends with Mike Forsyth? And then this woman said, well, then you need to tell him that it's no longer safe for him and his family in China and they need to leave. Something will happen and it'll look like an accident, but he'll be dead.
I hate to say it, but it looks like that part of their campaign is effective, which is to scare. So all the journalists are worried about what they do in China.